Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Sutton. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 36-year-old independent bookstore in the North Valley of Albuquerque. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I know there's a million things to do on the internet these days, so we're always pleased to have audience for our virtual events. I've done about 90 of these now since the pandemic started. And tonight, I'm very pleased to be presenting author Ioan Grillo in conversation with Sam Quinones. Thank you guys for being here with us. Thanks again, Bookworks fans. Bookworks is still closed for browsing. We're waiting to get back to that green or now turquoise level of opening. Bernalillo County is still in the yellow there. Our COVID numbers are going down slowly. We hope to be reopening back in the spring for book browsing. Right now, you can shop on our website, which is Bookworks without the O's. That's BKWRKS.com. I will pop that into the chat, as well as a link to buy Ioan Grillo's new book, Blood, Gun, Money. We are excited to talk about this book. The issues therein have a major effect on us here in New Mexico with border violence and cartel activity. And these two guys are here to give us the real scoop on what is fueling the violence at the border, whether it be drugs or guns or money. So we're excited to hear more. Ioan Grillo has written several books in addition to Blood, Gun, Money. You can check those out on our website as well. He is a contributing writer for the New York Times, based down in Mexico City right now. He's also written for Time Magazine, CNN, Reuters. He's worked for the History Channel. He's been down there covering these topics for decades, folks, so he really knows a lot. He's the author of El Narco, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award. You can get that one on our website too. And also Gangster Warlords. I'm not sure, is that still in print?
Yep, still selling it.
Cool. That one was the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. And then Sam, he's got several books under his belt as well. Antonio's Gun and Delfino's Dream from the University of New Mexico Press. This one is about immigration and those people hopping back and forth across the border, what their lives look like. Sam's also written a book called Dreamland, which we're quite familiar with here in New Mexico, covers the opioid crisis. And he's now still covering that, as well as the outbreaks of fentanyl and the deaths around that. So I know these guys have a lot to talk about. We're going to get started. If you have any questions, you can feel free to type those into the chat, or you can raise your hand at the end when we get to that period, and I'll be happy to call on you with some sound. So think about what they're saying. If you have anything you want to ask, feel free to jot that down. Ioan and Sam, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to learn more. How are you doing?
Great to be here, Amanda. Thank you very much. And I'm Sam Quinones. Good to see everybody. Ioan, really, thanks so much for this fantastic, pardon me, book. So timely, so necessary. There really is not a book that I've found anyway, like this, so specifically tied to guns coming out of the United States that affect violence in other places, specifically Mexico, which is a lot about what I want to ask you about today. But it's fantastic reporting. As you know, if you've read Ioan's other books, it's kind of a trademark. Great journalist out of Mexico. And as I said, it's one of these books that I think illuminates so much beyond what I think is a very superficial discussion about drug trafficking out of Mexico. It's a complicated thing and involves both sides of this of the border, and so I hope to get to some of that today. But first of all, how you doing? How's Mexico City treating you these days?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Ioan Grillo. I'm from the UK originally. I've been in Mexico 20 years. 20 arrived in the end of year 2000. Getting through the COVID right now this year, it's kind of things are never shut down that heavily because you can't shut down, 60 million informal workers who haven't got a other way to make money. And the number of deaths have been quite bad at times. But it's plodding on, and the numbers have gone a bit down there now. So yeah, we'll see.
Good, great. Well, yeah, it's been the headlines out of Mexico have been kind of scary when it comes to COVID these days, I have to say. But good to see you're hanging in there. So let me ask you, man. Give me your assessment first off, just to kind of set the stage. What is your assessment of the magnitude of the problem? We're talking about guns purchased, procured somehow in the United States that flow south into Mexico. Give us the estimates and how important you think they are in the violence that has occupied the headlines out of Mexico for so many years.
Sure. So I arrived here in 2000, started reporting in Mexico in 2001. And so I've been here and covered right through this modern era of violence in Mexico.
Right.
And so this 20 years, and really there was various times when it escalated. 2006, 2008, I think was a very key year in escalation. But this has been at such a level, the violence itself, I mean, we're talking about 300,000 murders the last decade. Overall, you know, 70% plus with firearms. About 70% probably related to cartels or to security forces fighting cartels. So it's really, there's discussion about what this is and even how to call or understand this level of violence. I think of it now as a kind of hybrid between crime and war, this kind of weird gray place in between the two, because it's not just regular crime. When you have, you know, there's been firefights with 500 guys against 2,000 federal police. That's not regular criminality. When you've got refugees fleeing places, when you've got these massacres. At the same time, you can't understand this as a regular, trying to make sense of it like a regular war, as I did for some years. Doesn't really make sense either. It's a weird hybrid thing. And this era of violence has all been come about because of the firearms. Now, if we look at the numbers, so we've got the numbers of specifically the guns traced. I like to use these because you can't argue with these numbers.
Right. What are
firearms taken from criminals, cartel members, and directly traced to US gun stores and gun factories. And we're talking about, since 2007, 164,000 firearms that trace has been made. So that's without a doubt, we know all of those guns have been there. But beyond that, the belief by estimates from US institutes and from the Mexican Foreign Ministry are of 200,000 plus guns a year flowing over the border. So 2 million, over 2 million in the last decade. It's tragic. The time that I've been in Mexico, to think when I arrived here, there was like several million guns less than there are now, and several 100,000 people murders less. It's kind of tragic to think of this. So the scale, those numbers are so mind-blowing in terms of the deaths and the number of guns.
Right.
It is a form of a hybrid armed conflict we struggle to understand. And it is a historic case of firearms trafficking.
Sure.
I mean, and imagine if in the United States you'd seen, now the United States has suffered this flood of drugs, which we'll talk about, heroin and opioids, and it's all connected. But if we'd seen in the United States a flood of millions of guns coming in and being part of the conflict in this way. Now, as well as that, it's not just the quantity of guns, but the type of guns. So we're seeing the AR-15s, the AK-47s made in the factories in Eastern Europe, imported into the United States, sold there, taken to Mexico, converted often to fully automatic. AR-15s made in the United States, sold and taken over. And these are the real big, these are the weapons really causing the big body counts, the big numbers of deaths.
Yeah. Right.
But also, I mean, a thing which has a real psychological impact are the 50 caliber rifles, the Barretts, you know, firing bullets of this size, bullets the size of Coca-Cola bottles or small knives. And it's the psychological impact, the fact they can buy these weapons in the US shops, $10,000 plus. And we can go later on into all the methods of the way these guns are acquired, exactly what's happening there. But these guns, and you see the psychological impact when they're used in ambushes, they're blowing right through police cars. There was crazy video from Culiacan 2019, when there were 700 to 800 gunmen said to take over the city against 350 soldiers, and they fired a 50 cal. There's video of this, and they blew a soldier's leg. It literally blew apart. The leg literally exploded. So you see the psychological impact of those, really makes the mess that it is now. I guess people don't know, in Mexico, there's only one gun shop in the entire country run by the army, which you have to go through a lot of ID things. So there are other ways. There are weapons being stolen from the Mexican military and so forth, but this iron river of guns is phenomenal.
We'll talk a little bit more about the Mexican military later, but yeah, the whole, I was actually under the impression that 50 caliber guns were not available, that was the one weapon, but your book was illuminating on that fact. What strikes me, as interesting about what your book describes is that it does not seem to be traffic in enormous quantities, at a time. It's more like 10 to 50 guns. It's not 500 to 2,000 guns, like 2,000 kilos of meth or whatever. It's more like small, like a la hormiga, it's kind of like this small ant-like trafficking south. And I was wondering if you think that's right, and why that's possible.
So I have a bunch of interviews in the book with gun traffickers.
Right. We'll get to them in a minute.
Yeah. So they give you a lot of different ways they show that guns are moved over, and a lot of different ways are happening at the same time. Now, generally, if you're driving, there have been cases, and there was a case with a truck with 147 AK-47s, which got busted trying to go into Mexico from the United States. But generally, it's a dozen at a time.
Right.
Because you put 147 boxed up AK-47s in a truck, that gets stopped on a highway, it's a lot of bulk. It's a lot of bulk there.
Right.
But sometimes a dozen, 2 dozen, sometimes disassembled pieces. You could just keep on going and going.
So it's like little raindrops, man. It just seems like endless raindrops of guns, it's like, it's not a big flood. It's just these small drops of them.
Yeah, but it's all adding up to the huge quantity. So like all the time, and these gun shops, particularly in the border states, someone's coming from further in the interior, but constantly coming down and flooding down in these numbers and adding up to a huge arsenal. And
it seems to me that that's just reflective of how easy it is to get gun. I mean, it's very hard to stash 50 guns, on a truck or something like that, but a dozen might work, 10 might work. It just seems to me it's just so reflective of how easy it is for people to come by these things. One of the things that really I loved about the book was you find these characters in different parts, and of course, your book deals with a wide-ranging geographically, Romania, Baltimore, some other places. But given that this is New Mexico we're talking about, and given the proximity to Mexico, I just thought I'd focus there. I love some of the characters, and I was just hoping you could tell me, a little bit about there's these different characters I'll name, and what their importance was to the story. The first one was this guy, Tony. And I believe he was in New Mexico, in fact, a Mexican-American, I believe, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
With a Juarez girlfriend or something like that. Give a little taste of what his story was and why he's important, why you included him.
Sure. I mean, what I've done a lot over the last 20 years, always looking to collect testimonies from gangsters, from criminals, try and get their life stories.
Yeah, sure.
And that's a big part of what I do in my work. With him, he's an interesting case because he was more middle class in that he was educated, had a decent job. He came from I think fairly working class family in California, but qualified. He was kind of a nerd. He said he had a single mom from Michoacan, but grew up in California. He said he was kind of a nerd. He was always playing with radio and stuff. He loved like tech stuff. So he qualified and he got a job in fiber optics around the border area. So he lived in Las Cruces, and he was laying fiber optics around driving around a lot in this truck and driving around New Mexico, Texas, but also into Mexico. And he had a pass, a government pass, to go into Mexico. So this again shows a level of corruption actually from private sector stroke sanctioned by the government, by the US government, and that corruption going over. So he had a girlfriend. She was from Juarez. She was living in Cruces, and he was hanging around with her brother as well, who was a bit more of a seasoned criminal with connections with the cartel, the Juarez cartel. And he started moving boxes of guns south, driving them over different ports of entry. Sometimes he would use the bridge, like not use the big bridge in El Paso, Juarez. He would use the slightly quieter ones like Palomas. They were one of the ones he would use over there. Palomas, Columbus, New Mexico, isn't it? I think it's so he would use those bridges over, and he was getting paid. He said he wasn't really doing this for the money. He was doing it more for the thrill at the time it began. He later on got more into just the money from it. And he was driving down, he said he liked the buzz of just going over and kind of beating the. One time he got stopped by Mexican police on the Mexican side to search his truck. And he just bluffed and said, look, there's airplanes down right now because I've got to come and I've got this equipment. If you stop me while we're talking here, there's airplanes being grounded, and the policeman backed off. And he used to go into his lockup in Ciudad Juarez where he would deliver the parts, and there he would interchange quickly with the cartel affiliates. And he brought down a lot of guns. Now for a while he did it. He eventually dropped out, and he introduced one of his work mates from the same company. He was getting paid about $1,500 a trip. So it was
so little, man. That seems like a remarkably low amount of money.
About
for the risk.
But he introduced one of his workmates who did it for a while, did it a lot more. I mean, you say it seems a little. You still, if you do a couple of weeks, $3,000, and you start making that money, with what you're making there. And the other person introduced eventually disappeared, and he doesn't know what happened to the guy who disappeared in Mexico. But Tony didn't get caught. He did later then rework again. He broke up with his girlfriend, but then he hooked up again with the cartel, actually using a scanner and watching out for the border patrol movements using a scanner, and then watching from the US side and reporting their movements. So, I mean, so these are stories of kind of people who
it seems to me interesting because he's the kind of guy that I'm imagining is a classic gun runner, in quotation marks, if you want to put it that way. A schmo, a kind of a guy, a working stiff who sees some extra money maybe to be made, or maybe it's the excitement. But it's like, if this is always the way it is with the US-Mexico border, it's like huge numbers of small guys, going back and forth and doing their crime business and so on. And it seemed to me, I don't know how typical would you say Tony is of the classic source of guns going south?
Well, you find, I mean, like these smugglers come in so many different shapes and sizes.
Sure.
And you see that. I mean, you see that with smuggling the drugs north. I mean, you've got also regular guys, and I mean, like also people get paid for smuggling marijuana. I mean, it used to be a couple of years ago, it was like $1,000 to bring them, the weed over the border as well. I mean, some of these things are kind of quite low level economy for a lot of this running. But this other guy, if I could go into Jorge, who's a more serious trafficker.
Right. I was going to ask you about him too. That here you've got a guy, and I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about Mesquite, Texas, and through the prism of Jorge, this guy you met in the Juarez prison. And tell us a little bit about his role and what he represents in the general gun trafficking south to Mexico.
Sure. So this was probably more typical. Though again, there's many different ways it's done. But Jorge was a guy in prison in Mexico, in the Ciudad Juarez prison. We went in there, and he was doing 9 years on Mexican federal firearms trafficking charges. So he was already in there, or Mexican firearms charges. So he was a young guy, and his method, he grew up in a town in Chihuahua, south of Juarez, several hours south. And the first time he got, his dad had a bit of money. His dad had a business exporting cattle. He had cattle from Chihuahua exporting to Texas and different things there. But he got his girlfriend pregnant when he was very young. And he was doing construction work for very little money. And the first time somebody asked him, he would go to Dallas and he would buy regular consumer stuff and bring it down to Chihuahua and sell it. So somebody asked him, can you go and get me an AR-15? Now the guy was cartel affiliated. So he asked him to go and get an AR-15. He went and got it, paid $700. The guy gave him $2,000 for it. So you see this quite, nice markup right away on a single gun. And then the guy asked him for more guns. So he set up in business with 3 of them. This guy in his town in Chihuahua, a guy who worked in Dallas area, and him going back and forth in a truck. Now he would go and started doing it every weekend, buying about a dozen guns, mostly AR-15s. So you start doing the maths on that. You see that, you're making $1,300, $1,400 a rifle, and you're doing a dozen. So, you're making $10,000, $15,000 a trip. In a month, that's $60,000. So it starts to be some quite serious money for him. I mean, he bought a house. He started having a bunch of cars. He's seen other, girlfriends beyond this. He started off trying to get enough to feed his baby, and then it was like that, and having a party and living very very large life. Now he described when he first described it to us, it was he'd go in there with no paperwork at all and buy the dozen AR-15s.
Go to a gun show, right? I mean, in Mesquite. That's what struck me. I didn't know this about Mesquite, Texas. It's kind of a gun show capital of America. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I mean, Mesquite's a huge place for gun shows, but there's a bunch of gun shows in the Dallas urban area and all over Texas. So when he described the issue, going to buy the guns with no ID whatsoever, and he described it as a black market. He said there's a black market at the gun shows, the kind of side black market. You ask until somebody says no ID. So we went up there. We drove from the prison in Juarez, and we drove to Mesquite, was where the big gun show was on. And we went in to check out the details of that story. We did recordings inside the gun show. And first of all, we found the people who said, no, you need ID. We're licensed gun sellers within the show. You need Texas ID. But then we found the people who were supposedly the private collectors. And it was the private collectors who then said, because they're private collectors, they're not obliged, but they're not really acting as private collectors. They're acting as gun sellers. They had whole tables full of boxed up AR-15s, and they said, here it is. Don't worry, no ID, cash. It's brand new. It hasn't been fired. We're selling to you a bit more than the shop. And this is
quite the collector gun.
Yeah,
right, yeah.
And this has been very documented. There's a case over in Florida of a guy who was going to gun shops, bought more than 500 guns. We told them at shows, and they were traced to murders around Latin America. They were the Florida trafficking route, where it goes on ships and it goes all. They ended up in Puerto Rico, in Colombia, and various places. So we saw that, and that was one of the moments actually I decided to this book. I want to do this book because for a long time I thought this issue is just banging my head against the wall. We really can't, because the American Second Amendment is so strong, because the issue of we're not going to move on guns is so strong, even after things like, Sandy Hook, even after these things, I thought, if school children are dying in the United States, why are they going to care about 200,000 people being murdered in Mexico?
Right.
But then when I saw this, I realized this doesn't have to be about assault rifle bans. There's ways. I mean, the fact that just letting cartel affiliates drive into the United States and buy all the rifles they want. Then other cases you see, another case of firearms that I trace to the murder in Mexico of an American ICE agent, Jaime Zapata, murdered in San Luis Potosí, along with Victor Avila, who's a guy from El Paso, an ICE agent who's from El Paso, who was shot and survived that shooting. And in that case, you saw more the issue of straw purchasing, but you saw a guy going to a shop there, buy 10 AK-47s from the shop with ID, but like no alarm bell rung.
Yeah, right.
Buy the 10 AK-47s, and then they went to the cartel. And the guy who did that only got probation. Even though
it's interesting, man. When I was reading this, I was reminded. I spent a lot of time in Phoenix with the kidnapping squad of Phoenix PD. And one day, the guy said the night before he had been in Cabela's, that big hunting and outdoors shop, and he saw these guys pushing around these carts, laden with ammunition. And he recognized them for what they were, and he's a cop. He's following them through the store. He goes out to the outside, and there's a van that was literally weighed down with all the stuff that they were buying, and yet the people in the store were like oblivious to this. This was just kind of like special, apparently normal. He finally got them to call the Glendale Police Department. The Glendale Police Department kind of stopped these guys from actually going south. But nevertheless, it struck me as like, wow, man, don't these stores have any? You were asking some of the killers that you interviewed that don't, about their own qualms, the guy in Baltimore and some other, about their own qualms about what they do. I'm always wondering about these gun sellers, Cabela's and these other places. Shouldn't you spend a lot of time assessing your customers, because you know where they're going with this stuff a lot of time, particularly near the border?
Yeah, I mean, so I have like interviews there with gun sellers and with gun brokers and people all across this business. And there's a guy, so I went all the way to Eastern Europe and to look at how AK-47s is used there, and the history of AK-47s. I think it's very interesting, because this war in Mexico, this hybrid conflict in Mexico, is made possible because of the invention of the AK-47, and then later the invention of the AR-15, M16, the American answer, invented in Hollywood, of all places. I went to the place where they invented the AR-15. But then I saw one of the brokers there, a Bulgarian guy, and I was asking him about, what if some of these guns are used to murder people, not in the Americas, but also some of these same factors are making guns that end up with the Islamic State, ends up in various places. And he said, well, I'm not, if the paperwork's all solid, if the stuff's legal, I'm not worried. And I was like, well, yeah, but are you worried ethically if this stuff goes to be used in murders? Right. And he sat there for a while and he said, no. And it was an honest answer, but it shows that in the gun business, people are sealing off their corner. Now, there are other people. Another person I interviewed in detail from Arizona was a guy called Mike Detty, who was a firearms seller who became a confidential informant for the ATF. And he was seeing this, that everyone was coming in, buying guns, taking them to cartels. So he would tell the ATF, and they recruited him as a confidential informant, set him up to have tape conversations, set him up to kind of follow and build this stuff. And he said, like, I do care. I don't want these guns being used to kill people in Mexico. But those that investigation didn't go anywhere, and that's very sad. And that was a prelude to the Fast and Furious investigation out of Phoenix, Arizona, which is
doomed, kind of a sad chapter in the history of the ATF, in which they were trying to track those guns going south and so on, and ended up in the wrong hands. I was hoping you might tell us a little bit too about this guy in Mexico that you met, I think in Tepito, the famous or infamous barrio in Mexico City, a guy named Val, who apparently was once in the military, and how the military seems to be also a major source of weapons. Can you tell us Val's story a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, like anywhere, like most places that guns are illegal, whereas drugs, you see drugs sold very, very openly in some places. I mean, in the United States, in Baltimore, the open air drug markets are, pretty amazing there. But also places where you see drugs very, very openly sold. And I haven't seen guns sold that openly, like everyone like on the street with tables of guns, selling them really openly that way, illegally. It's more like asking from contacts. So Tepito's an infamous, a folkloric neighborhood in the heart of Mexico City. Folkloric for famous boxers and boxing gyms, and a big market neighborhood, and very, very dense market.
Children of Sanchez was written there and all that, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great place in its sense. So from one of the guys who's a trainer at a boxing gym there, he introduced me to a guy who does sell guns in the neighborhood, who was a neighbor of his in a vecindad, one of these old houses on the edge of Tepito. And he was in the military when he was very young. He joined this guy now was hitting 50, but was joined the military as a teenager in the 80s. And in the military, he carried out extrajudicial murders in the military, right? Which he described, and began selling guns from the military. And this was the guns they were often seizing. So these in that case were not actually the military issue guns they were selling, but guns they would seize from criminals and resell them. And this is very, very common. There was a murder carried out in the city of Cuernavaca, where very, very openly, everyone had this on video, where the guy went up and shot and killed somebody at point blank range, and they found that gun had been taken off the street before in the police station and then resold. So this guy got his start in the military, and then when he left the military, we still had the military contacts or police contacts, and would be kind of removing stolen guns in that way. So from that sense, you see, now these are American guns again, but they're being, you see the problem of corruption is, horrific on this side, as well as the corruption and the system on the US side, with this loop of guns and violence happening.
Sure. Yeah, no, it struck me as a fairly dismal part of the book, honestly, because it just, the Mexican military are, the last, apparently, the last line of defense against the cartel, this toxic influence going on as Mexican drug cartels in that country. And to see them so easily, and so, I kind of had this inkling about it, but never graphically the way he described in your book. Very, very powerful part of the book, I thought, mainly for me, because I just was used to thinking of the Mexican military as less corrupt, or something, and well, you get disabused of this stuff. I guess, it's something.
I see a comment from Roberto Lozano. Hi, Roberto. Good to see you there. So the seized guns go straight to criminals after the photo op. Sadly, that can be the case sometimes. And that's why, I feel this problem is not intractable. One of the things I find it frustrating. I think, like many people covering this violence over years, it doesn't get better. When you see the human harm this does to people. And I see, like, in the book I go to, while I was doing this, the mass grave in Veracruz was found, the biggest mass grave in Mexico in recent history. So that was more than 250 skulls in there.
God damn.
And the woman whose son was taken away by gunmen, and who ended up searching, and they found, because her son was abducted by gunmen. He was a customs agent. They were looking for him, and then when on a Mother's Day march of mothers looking for their sons, they found this. Somebody came up and gave them a map, a hand-drawn map. They went and found this mass grave, and eventually her son was identified in the bodies there, which was right next to a housing area. So seeing these kind of things really brings home the need to try and reduce this violence. And I feel it's not intractable, but it does have to be an effort on both sides of the border as well.
Yeah.
But I think
it's interesting. We were talking earlier, early in my career as a reporter, my first daily journalism job, it was a job that dramatically changed my interests. I was a crime reporter in the city of Stockton, and 4 months after I got to the paper, they had the mass shooting at Cleveland Elementary School in January of 1989 by Patrick Purdy, who shot himself just before the cops arrived, and that kind of thing. But it was a transformative event in my life, I can tell you. But but also for the country, because it led to the assault rifle ban, and that then under George Bush 1, and then Clinton a little bit, and then George Bush 2 allowed that to pass as no longer the law of the land. What struck me about, and since then I've covered 7 mass murders. I was in Phoenix with Gabby Gifford and all those. I've covered a number of those things. Each time, what I remember the case was that people would say, well, they proposed solutions, but they would say, well, that wouldn't have stopped all of this. And my feeling has always been, it won't stop exactly this case, but it will do some good. But it's as if we're kind of paralyzed by the idea proposed by, I think, the gun lobby, that if something doesn't solve it all, then it's pointless to pursue it as an idea or as a policy. And it seems to me, in a lot of what you are discussing in the last part of your book are these smaller solutions, the composite solution made up of many things. For example, the 50 caliber weapon that you mentioned, and so on. And so I just wanted to get a little bit of an idea of what your thoughts are about some of these, again, a mosaic of solutions rather than one big magic bullet, pardon the pun, that would solve the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I see with all of this stuff, I mean, like, I feel how can people live with this level of violence? And also in the US cities where the violence, the shootings are very bad and they're now increasing, in fact, how is this still allowed to happen? How does this case carry on? And I think the idea of this can all be, zapped away is not going to happen. We have to be sort of realistic and look for harm reduction. So that's why, I mean, I feel my book's a work of investigation, not preaching. I'm just trying to look about how this black market of guns, which has been really understudied, I think, considering how important the black market of guns is. And not only, the United States cities, not only Mexico, but also reaching more than 100 countries and reaching Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, where we have violence there and people fleeing that as refugees. So you have things like the universal background check. Now they could pass that tomorrow. It's got support of 89% of Americans in one survey, 81% of conservatives. Things like increasing punishment of straw buyers, sentencing for straw buyers, the people who have clean records, who are buying guns for cartels, who are mostly just getting probation. Things like just having these alarms. So if somebody goes to buy 50 cal, just check out who it is. If it's a regular person, buying a gun for a hobbyist, but that's okay. They can check that out. But if it's a cartel affiliate, they should a bit check into this. So there's things I think there that can make a difference if there was the political will. Now there's still like a kind of broken political system.
Yeah, it seems to me one thing I've kind of wondered why we don't do is put at each of the border crossings from the United States into Mexico, ATF agents, people with technology that can be able to maybe discern this stuff as it passes through. And then, just kind of, it seems to me that we need to do something to stop the flow of guns south. And I think that and keeping in mind the enormous power of the gun lobby in this country, that might be acceptable, to them, to have people at each border crossing doing that, just like checking for guns going south is our way of saying, this is what we're doing. Certainly Mexico has enormous culpability in all this. I think it's beyond dispute, I think, but I would like to see my own country kind of take its own responsibility seriously, which it clearly, when it comes to guns, it clearly has not done that,
Yeah, sure. I mean, they tried a bit sometimes, these kind of checkpoints, like a border style checkpoint, like close, not at the border itself. And they didn't tend to be enough. I mean, because the traffic, there's so many cars going past. It's like drugs going north. So I think, I mean, I look at these kind of various measures. You can cut off the way the guns are acquired so easily and just make this. I mean, right now, there's not really any serious effort. And I think partly because if you talk to a lot of regular gun owners and say you're okay with universal background checks, they're okay with that. You're okay with straw buyers having sentences. You're okay with it. They're okay. But the NRA, or elements of the gun lobby have taken a kind of crusade of good against, for them, it's like they're trying to get our guns, we can't allow anything. And this is, we're fighting this to kind of stop everything. Should we allow some questions? There's one question here we had that I got sent on a tweet. Shall I throw this one out and then take some more from the?
Sure. Go ahead, man. Go.
So this one was, and I think very connected to this is so this question is, what's changed since Dreamland? Sam's amazing. I think the defining book of the opioid crisis in how drugs are bought in and distributed. To say again with the gun issue, one thing I discovered, I think is very, very key to this, is that this gun trade and the drug trade are just intertwined.
Yeah, sure.
It's like there's just two plants wrapped around. So this problem, the living, the joint problems now, 70,000 plus overdose deaths in the United States, 34,000 murders, the guns, the drugs, this all intertwined. So you have to see these things. Do you want to answer that question, Sam?
Well, yeah, I think one of the things I thought that you brought up in your book that I think is going to be part of my next book, actually, which I'm working on now, finishing up now, hopefully out in the fall, is that drugs, we've had in the last 4 years, this big focus on building yet another wall at the border. And of course, people who know the border know that there's lots of walls on the border. Juarez, Tijuana, all these places of a lot of population. There's lots of walls, and that walls won't stop the most of our drugs come through those walls or come through those border crossings, those ports of entry. And I think what the questioner is referring to is that it's no longer just this group that I was discussing and writing about in Dreamland. These guys from the small town in Nayarit, they were actually never the only black tar heroin traffickers. They were important to the story because they were black tar heroin traffickers and were selling in the area where those pain pills were all of a sudden becoming this great subject of enormous promotion and so on. But what has happened with drugs since then is that, and particularly with opiates and now of course with methamphetamine, that is just the market has just exploded, and so many more people, both in the United States, buying say fentanyl from China, shipped in, or so many people selling what's coming in from Mexico, so many more people from Mexico getting involved, particularly in the northwestern states, Sinaloa, of course, Nayarit, Durango, Chihuahua, Michoacan, Guerrero, so places like that. And so to me, what's happened is not that there's one group it's just that there's so many. And we speak about cartels. My way of thinking about Mexican drug trafficking is that part of it is a cartel, but really most of it, or a lot of it, is just enormous numbers of independent operators, all kind of looking for, like Tony, or Jorge, or one of these guys, looking for their next score, kind of from a drug, to be able to send 50 kilos of meth to Atlanta or someplace like that. But it seems to me now the Mexican drug trafficking world has awakened to our opioid epidemic, figured out that they had a brand new market of heroin, and then of course realized that now fentanyl was the perfect substitute for it. And really where we are now is in a situation where there basically is the drug trafficking world is understood. It's synthetic drugs are the profit centers. It's kind of like foolish to own land and grow your own drugs if you can make them in a laboratory with access to world chemical markets through the two ports on the Pacific coast there. So that's kind of how things have changed. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit to that, the opioid market, you have these crazy things. I mean, you had this boom in demand for opioids, and so everyone's suddenly growing opium and the massive expansion of opium production in Mexico. Then fentanyl coming in, and the big thing, in fact, of heroin injected with fentanyl. So people now, another character I talk about in the book, actually, a guy called Billy Jack Curtis, who was of a prison gang, the Dirty White Boy. He was involved in trafficking guns inside the United States, but he was a heroin addict for many years, and he was saying, well, now people are liking only heroin, which has got the fentanyl kick. You don't want regular heroin anymore. And then suddenly you have over demand and the price of opium then going down, and then people complaining in Guerrero, in these places with Mexico, they're producing heroin or opium poppies. They're not making the money anymore. Got some more questions here. So have three from Justin Solomon. Hi, Justin. Have 3D guns ever presented an issue? The whole ordeal, 3D printed guns. So I go into that in the book, and that's a very important point. So there's a lot of, I think, confusion and I think misrepresentation in the press about the issue of 3D printed guns. So you have this idea, which the gun lobby actually ran with, and they were quite happy to run with this. You had a guy called Cody Wilson who created this 3D printed gun and said, you just, on a cheap 3D printer, here are the plans, just press a button and bang, out pops this 3D printed gun. And that was like this idea that, the entire gun debate's gone. Everyone can just make their own guns. There's no point in even having this discussion now, because everyone just press a button and they've all got guns. It actually turns out that gun doesn't work. They did tests on it. I mean, basically, it's really dangerous. And they did tests in the UK with this. They did tests in the US. I talked to ATF people about it. People fire these things, blow up in their face. And the thing is luckily, the cheap 3D plastics are not good. You can't just use cheap 3D plastics to make a gun. Now, there are some 3D printers at the rural top end. We're talking about $500,000 stuff that can make these different complicated methods of making 3D printed guns. But at that price, it's the same as actually having the machinery to buy, like factory machinery to make regular guns. It's not a game changer. Now, there is something which you see more, the ghost guns. Now, ghost guns, not as 3D printed guns mostly, but as the kits they're buying off the internet. And you see this in Los Angeles, where now they're picking up loads of people buying kits off the internet, assembling them with no serial numbers. And you see it in Mexico with people bringing parts from the United States. There was a little workshop here run by the Jalisco New Generation cartel, bringing parts and assembling firearms. And that was using the 3D printed. So that was using the off the internet parts. So one thing to do to hit this is also to try and actually regulate the gun kits off the internet. And they say people who can buy them need to be like buying any other firearm, because right now it's very easy to buy the parts with no ID in many cases, or using ways to bypass that.
One last question is, how do you guys think the legalization, decriminalization of drugs in the US will change the dynamics? Okay, how about it, John?
Do you want to kick off with that one?
Well, legalization of marijuana has, pushed the drug world in Mexico into heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamine in a bigger way, I think. And so I think that one of the reasons why we have so much methamphetamine in the United States, apart from the way they make it, which is another whole other topic we could talk about, is because so many people lost revenue that they kind of come to rely on by selling marijuana. And so they just switched, My feeling about decriminalization is a complicated one, but I believe that decriminalization is coming a little too late, because right now what we have on the streets, if you decriminalize a person, say you arrest somebody for, possessing fentanyl or syringe or whatever paraphernalia, and possession of stolen property, say he's got a stolen laptop or something like that. All of this is clearly a sign that this person is addicted and needs help, right? And decriminalization means you would either not arrest him, or by the time he gets to the jail, they just kick him loose and go right back to using whatever he's using. And so to me, decriminalization with the drugs, the extraordinarily potent, deadly and mentally mangling drug like methamphetamine is actually the misguided compassion, it feels to me. You are taking people who are clearly in trouble, clearly in pain, clearly need help, and you're saying, well, I'm not going to arrest you because they're never going to prosecute this charge, or it's decriminalized now. sometimes, a lot of times people who are arrested for these small charges, those small charges are really more like a cry for help. And decriminalization is kind of part of saying, well, we're not going to arrest you for that anymore. To me, that's a short answer, frankly, to a complicated problem.
I've got a bit of a different take on this. I believe broadly in the idea of drug policy reform. So I think if we look at what does drug policy reform mean, I mean, I think we could accept the war on drugs began in 1971 or declared by Richard Nixon in 1971 when he said, drugs are public enemy number one, and he defined this idea, had again this kind of vision that we can abolish drugs from American life, and there are no drugs anymore. And there will be no heroin. There'll be no issue. And then we see like 50 years later, it's the 50th year of that this year. And we see record overdose deaths in the United States.
Yeah.
So we can take, and a lot of us can agree with it's a failure. And I think even now that the concept of war on drugs is even more pushed by us critics than actually the government officials don't even want to talk about a war anymore. But we're still stuck kind of moving with these prohibitionist policies or these issues of the black market being so big. So I think drug policy reform means to accept we've got to try and change this and try and fix this and try and make a better way. We're still seeing failure in drug policy. And it could mean legalization, in some cases decriminalization, and generally looking at harm reduction. Now, I think marijuana, we should go the whole way now. I mean, we're in a half house now. I think we've got to move the whole way, because right now, as we speak, there's still Mexican cartels growing marijuana, and it's still being smuggled over the border. There's still people being shot on Baltimore street corners over selling marijuana today.
Right.
When it's legal in like so legalized so heavily in much of the United States. So I think marijuana go the whole way now. I think the argument over marijuana, I mean, there's still some debates, but I think that argument's basically gone. And then first, I think the idea of massive rehab. Now, the American Medical Association says that 90% of people who need help for addiction are not getting it. So it's really the idea of investment and trying to reach people.
Yeah.
But then we do get to a very, very sticky part of this whole argument of what do we actually do about heroin and crystal meth and cocaine? Right.
I mean, think about it. Think about this, man. I am sympathetic to drug legalization, but I do not trust American capitalism to pull it off with any kind of responsibility. The whole opioid issue began because of legal drugs who were promoted like over-the-counter aspirin almost. I mean, seriously, that's kind of what happened. So find me an example of an addictive substance or service that American capitalism has not made more so. Social media, chicken nuggets, sugar, pornography, gambling. You can go on and on and on. And frankly, trusting American capitalism with methamphetamine, I'm sorry. So anyway, it's a very, very long discussion and a complicated one, and I think we might be running out of time a little bit, but I kind of came to a very different perspective studying all this than I had when I lived in Mexico. I came to believe that demand was not the issue. Supply creates these problems, and the opioid epidemic is like a perfect example of that. And I think, frankly, just to end on it, it seems to me that the gun issue, it's supply. It gets down to supply, right? I mean, it gets down to just the amount of guns, the simple number of guns that are circulating here and in Mexico are just unconscionable, it seems to me.
Should we take another question from the audience? Anyone want to raise a hand or
anyone else have anything that they would like to ask? I am curious about gun shows. Having grown up in Oklahoma, which is, into a family that has members in the NRA, I want to know about gun shows. And, Sam, I think, made some really good points about capitalism and regulation and how that tends to maybe sometimes not go the way we think it should. What is being done about regulating the black market trade that stems from what are supposedly legal gun shows and legal sellers? Is there anybody really regulating that or checking in on those places? Or is this just kind of a free-for-all place for people to pick up guns for the black market?
Yeah, so that's meant to be regulated by the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, which is the gun police, and I go a lot into the book about the ATF and kind of really into the history of the ATF and their role. They're kind of a curious agency, the ATF. They're a lot poorer than like the FBI, the DEA, all the other big federal agencies. They're like way poorer, and they've really had these laws which has really hurt, made it hard for them to do their job. You find this crazy stuff. I went to the ATF Trade Center in West Virginia, and you find this crazy stuff like the fact that when people trace guns, you're not allowed to digitally trace a gun. So even if literally a smoking gun is found at a murder scene, they've got the smoking gun and they've got the serial number. You can't just, police don't even know this themselves. Police will phone up and go, we've got a gun, we've got the gun. Let's trace this. And they go, we can't trace that on a computer. We're not allowed to. The law stops us using computers to do this because of what the NRA has achieved. So they have to say, we're going to make phone calls. And literally in the place, they had these huge piles of bits of paper, literally mountains of bits of paper. They were not allowed to make into a digital database. They were legally not allowed to do this because of the law, these things. So you this kind of crazy situation, almost quite bizarre, kind of surreal stuff. They were even started saying, well, we can make, it's exactly right from Roberta, there's no digital. And that's one of the big things. They believe the digital gun registry means that they'll know where everyone's guns are and they'll take everyone's guns away. That's the big fear put out by the kind of that
a dictatorship of the government will come and take all our guns away, and that we won't be able to fight back against them.
Yeah. The scenes from Red Dawn, where in fact Red Dawn, you have a scene where they arrive and they go through the gun records, and they start taking everyone's guns in the communist invasions. Now, in terms of actually what's happening with this black market of guns, like you say, of being policed or not being policed, so there's just so much slack. It's amazing what you can get away with. It's amazing you literally can still now go to a gun show, buy a bunch of guns. Now, when I was there at one of these gun shows, there was a woman in front of me, and the guy said to her, basically, she told the guy, I can't buy guns legally. And he went ahead and sold it. One of these guys sold her a gun. I mean, but it happened right in front of me. And this is stuff they have on tape. In one of the transcripts, I got some of this from when ATF actually did do undercover in some of these cases. They had one where the ATF guy went in there with an undercover tape recorder, and he said, I want to buy a gun. He goes, I'm a criminal. I've got a record. I can't really buy this. And the guy said, this was during the Obama presidency. He said, yeah, don't tell Obama about it. and like sold him, that was on tape there. So it's kind of incredible what you can get away with. And these are also like gun shops themselves, that sometimes they can break these laws. Then the gun shops themselves will just get a slap on the wrist. So it's like part of this is almost like a fear from the ATF. They have some good agents and some people trying to do good stuff, but they really have restrictions on them and what they can do, what they can get away with.
I'm wondering how much of the gun traffic south, I'm not sure how much time we have, but if there's more time, I'll just ask this question. How much of the gun traffic south is made up of stolen guns? When I was in Stockton, I did a whole story on this one gun store burglary. A guy slipped in through the roof and ripped off 35 guns and the year before. And by the time I was writing the story, I think they'd just confiscated in one form or another half of them, and a few of them were in San Diego, Seattle. They'd been involved in a variety of crimes and so on. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how much. It's one big thing that we don't really address. We just have very thin laws with regard to guns, burglaries, and robberies, and so on. What percentage do you imagine of the guns going south are actually stolen?
So basically there's four big methods for getting guns into the black market. And the four methods are the gun hole loophole, so the gun shows, the straw purchasing, the ghost guns and the kits, and the fourth one is theft. Now you see this, and you see there's videos of this from CCTV cameras, where these people jump into these stores, and some of these guns are not kept in locked cabinets. Right. They just open them and take out, some of these like 15-second robberies, go in there, bang, fill out a bag full of guns and take them. Again, it gets to this kind of question of laws. there's laws, federal laws about how you have to lock up pharmacies. There's federal laws about how you have to lock up money. There's no federal laws about how you lock up guns. Right. Again, another achievement of the NRA. It's like all of these little things you see, which again, I think, you know, so that's again for the fourth thing. So I think, you know, these are the things I discovered, I think, in the investigation. These are the things that can be moved on like right away. Right. You know, attacking all four of these at the same time. So just, you know, I mean, the vast majority of people would have no problem with gun stores having to lock up cabinets if they have guns and protect them properly. They wouldn't have a problem with the idea that you can't have people abusing and selling, you know, guns and abusing this law in gun shows. They wouldn't have a problem with people having to have proper ID to buy gun kits, or people who are buying guns for cartels getting prison time. So I think these things, if they were all hit together, you could make a big difference without even getting to the really heavy debates like assault rifle ban, which is an issue. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a huge issue to talk about, but just saying before we even get there to a really heated debate, these things could change.
Yeah.